Imagine the scene: molten plaster, creamy and warm, cascades over a body, sealing the eyes, filling the ears, and perfectly suffocating the skin within the confines of a lead coffin. It sets almost instantaneously. 17 centuries later, the organic material is long gone, flesh, muscle, and hair, but the plaster remains. It provides a perfect, high-resolution 3D negative print of the deceased. Every minute detail is preserved: the faint line of a scar, the precise weave of the funeral shroud, even individual strands of hair. This phenomenon is known as a gypsum burial, a uniquely intimate encounter with the past, solidifying the very moment a life ended. These pristine white shells are more than just casings for skeletal remains. They freeze the exact, final instant a Roman citizen departed this world, forcing us, the living, to confront the ancient dead directly. This isn't just a clinical lesson ripped from a dry textbook. This is the tangible, immediate history of York, a city literally built upon the bodies and the bones of the people who forged its foundation. Before we dive deeper into these forgotten stories of survival, suffering, and incredible ambition, if you appreciate learning about the hidden truths woven into the fabric of history, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing for more content like this. We also encourage you to comment below and tell us where you are listening from. It truly is remarkable that we explore these ancient narratives together, connected across time and space and vast distances by our shared curiosity about the past. Our story truly begins with an invasion. In 71 AD, roughly 5,000 pairs of Calagi, heavy, hobnailed sandals, churned the wet mud at the strategic junction of the rivers Ouse and Foss. The legendary 9th Legion Hispana didn't seek permission to occupy the north. They violently carved it out. They drove a massive fortress into the very heart of the Brigantian tribal territory, swift and surgical, like a dagger. They named this outpost Eboracum. They systematically felled the native sacred yew trees and replaced the wilderness with a formidable, 50-acre military killing machine. This fortress was not erected for simple governance or regional administration. It was built purely for domination. The legionaries quickly erected massive timber walls, dug imposing defensive ditches, and established a rigid grid system, a layout that, remarkably, still dictates the flow of the modern city streets beneath our feet today. Violence, paradoxically, fueled the initial economy. Outside the austere fortress gates, a chaotic yet vigorous support system, known as the Vikings, sprang up. The encampment exploded with life and commerce. Blacksmiths hammered out iron blades for the deadly gladius swords, tanners cured essential leather for tents and armor, and merchants loudly hawked exotic wares sourced from the furthest, most disparate reaches of the burgeoning empire. Roman Eboracum rapidly transformed from a rough military encampment into a sophisticated, cosmopolitan hub. People flooded into the region. Consider the famous ivory bangle lady, whose remains suggest she walked these very streets, adorned in North African jewelry, tangible proof that travel and trade successfully bridged continents long before the age of modern flight. Yet, beneath this veneer of luxury and civilization, violence always reigned supreme. The dark truth is visible, literally, in the unearthed bones. At Driffield Terrace, archaeologists uncovered a shocking scene of carnage: the remains of 80 men, all meticulously decapitated. Disturbingly, whoever interred them placed their heads carefully between their knees or down by their feet. This was clearly not a careless disposal. It signifies a calculated, ritual execution. Further analysis revealed other horrific signs. Some skeletons bore clear bite marks from powerful animals, specifically lions and bears. Were these men gladiators who fell in a bloody arena, or perhaps disgraced soldiers brutally purged after a failed mutiny? While their names are lost to time, the evidence is damning. They met violent ends directly at the merciless hands of the Roman state. This strategic brutality and military importance drew immense power. Eboracum became so vital that it began to physically pull the center of gravity of the entire Roman Empire northwards. It hosted not just provincial governors, but reigning emperors themselves. The most powerful men on earth journeyed thousands of miles to this muddy, distant frontier to personally command their legions. They arrived bringing the entire imperial court, along with all its political intrigue and fabulous gold. However, York developed a peculiar and dark curse for these rulers. It welcomed them as earthly gods, but it rarely permitted them to leave alive. In 208 AD, the geopolitical center of the known world dramatically shifted. It relocated from the luxurious marble halls of the capital to the damp, formidable stone fortress of Eboracum. Emperor Septimius Severus arrived with his entire imperial court in tow. Severus, a powerful man of African origin born in modern-day Libya, ruled the vast empire with an iron fist, crushing dissent across 3 continents. He certainly didn't journey to York for a vacation. He came to launch a war of absolute annihilation. The tribes of Scotland, the Meati and the Caledonians, had repeatedly broken their treaties, and Severus, though aging and severely crippled by the pain of gout, determined to solve the problem permanently. Severus immediately transformed York into the operational headquarters of the vast Roman Empire. For 3 intense years, the most powerful and consequential decisions on earth were formulated and delivered right here, amidst the Yorkshire mud. Severus launched a campaign of almost unspeakable brutality. Initially, he ordered his soldiers to execute everyone capable of bearing arms. Then, in a horrific expansion of the mandate, his command to the legions chillingly echoed a line from Homer, *, "Let no one escape sheer destruction, not even the babe in the womb of the mother." This was far beyond mere conquest. It was an attempted genocide. The legions marched north, systematically burning villages and slaughtering livestock, intending to starve the native population into total extinction. But the sheer stubbornness of the North broke him. The relentless guerrilla warfare and the unforgiving harsh climate eventually wore the aging emperor down. In February 211 AD, Septimius Severus died in York. His body was solemnly cremated on a pyre just outside the city walls. His loyal soldiers collected his ashes, placed them in an urn made of imperial purple stone, and shipped them back to Rome. Yet his ghost perhaps lingered. He was the first emperor to die within these northern walls, but he would certainly not be the last. York had cemented its reputation as a lethal trap for the Caesars. Just a century later, in 306 AD, Emperor Constantius Chlorus also drew his final breath within the governor's palace at Eboracum. His passing immediately triggered one of the most significant, world-altering moments in human history. Typically, the succession of power in Rome was a long, messy bureaucratic process, decided by a distant senate or powerful generals. Not this time. The moment life left Constantius's body, his formidable son stepped forward, Constantine. The troops adored him. Outside the fortress, a massive, adrenaline-charged crowd of soldiers gathered. They did not wait for formal permission from Rome. Instead, they hoisted Constantine onto their shields and instantly hailed him as Augustus, Emperor of the West. A modern bronze statue stands outside York Minster today commemorating this exact event. It portrays Constantine lounging thoughtfully in a chair, a picture of serene contemplation. The reality, however, must have been vastly different. He should be depicted covered in sweat, adrenaline, and sudden imperial ambition. That single, explosive moment in York ignited a critical chain of events that culminated in the Christianization of the entire Roman Empire. Had the legions in York failed to proclaim him emperor, Constantine might never have marched on Rome, never have experienced the fabled vision of the cross, and Christianity might have forever remained a minor, fringe cult. In this sense, the spiritual landscape of the entire modern Western world was forged in a dramatic, on-the-spot military coup in northern England. But empires, like men, are mortal. The fall of Roman Eboracum was not marked by a sudden, decisive bang, but by a slow, agonizing whimper of decay. By the early 5th century, the legions were desperately recalling troops to defend a rapidly crumbling Rome against barbarian threats much closer to the capital. The garrison at York thinned out dramatically. Paychests ceased arriving. The maintenance of the grand imperial infrastructure collapsed entirely. The intricate hypocaust heating systems beneath the magnificent bathhouses clogged with soot and went permanently cold. The sewers backed up. The massive stone bridges, left untended, began to crumble into the river Ouse below. Then came the fatal letter. In 410 AD, Emperor Honorius sent a message to the besieged cities of Britain, Look to your own defenses. Rome was gone. The people of Eboracum were entirely on their own. The city swiftly entered a terrifying twilight zone. The grand stone buildings did not physically vanish, but their purpose inverted. Squatters moved into the old headquarters, Principia*. They lit crude fires directly upon magnificent mosaic floors that once depicted Roman gods. The relentless wind whistled mournfully through the gaps in the broken tiled roofs. Eboracum became the haunting skeleton of a metropolis, inhabited by a diminished population desperately trying to cling to the memory of civilization, while the wild forest and the thick fog encroached from all directions. The light of Rome flickered out. For the next 4 centuries, history plunges into darkness. We possess almost no written records from this period. We only know that the Anglians eventually arrived, renaming the crumbling ruins Eoforwic. But across the treacherous North Sea, a new and terrible storm was gathering, one that would bring a type of violence far more terrifying than the disciplined, methodical cruelty of Rome. The dragon ships were coming. November 1st, 866 AD, All Saints' Day. The cathedral bells of Eoforwic were ringing, summoning the pious. Inside the churches, the Northumbrian nobility bowed their heads in deep prayer, unarmed and fatally distracted. They believed their Christian God would protect them. They were disastrously wrong. The great heathen army cared nothing for the sanctity of the Christian calendar. They coldly exploited it. While the city prayed, a massive force of thousands of Danes, led by the sons of the legendary Viking hero Ragnar Lothbrok, breached the crumbling, ancient Roman walls. This was fundamentally different from the hit-and-run raids previously conducted on isolated monasteries like Lindisfarne. Raids implied a temporary venture and an eventual return home. These Vikings, however, brought their wives, their children, and their plows. They did not come merely to steal silver. They came to steal the land itself, to settle and to conquer. Leading this tidal wave of steel was a figure whose name still haunts the nightmares of British history, Ivar the Boneless, Ivar and Bainlazi*. Few characters in York's long saga are as enigmatic or as terrifying. His nickname sparks endless historical debate. Did he truly suffer from osteogenesis imperfecta, brittle bone disease, forcing him to be carried into battle on a shield? Or was boneless a metaphor, perhaps suggesting a snake-like, deceptive flexibility in combat, or even a cruel reference to impotence? The contemporary chronicles portray him not as a brute warrior relying on physical strength, but as a master tactician, a cold, calculating genius who viewed the theater of war as a massive game of chess played with human pieces. From the relative safety of his litter, it is said he directed the ensuing slaughter with nothing more than a simple flick of his hand. The Northumbrian kings, Osbert and Alla, were tragically busy fighting a crippling civil war against one another when the Vikings landed. Panic, however, finally united them. 4 months later, they recklessly marched on Eoforwic, determined to retake the city. This proved to be a fatal strategic mistake. In the interim, the Vikings had expertly repaired the ancient Roman defenses. When the Northumbrians finally breached the outer walls, they found themselves instantly funneled into a nightmarish kill box. The narrow streets of York, originally designed for rigid Roman military order, became a labyrinth of death. The Vikings efficiently trapped the English army between the stone ramparts and the fortified houses. It was a complete massacre, and both kings perished. The death of King Aella is tied to a specific, horrifying legend that refuses to fade from historical memory, the ritual of the blood eagle. According to Norse sagas, Ivar sought brutal vengeance for the execution of his father, Ragnar. He allegedly ordered Aella's back to be cut open, the ribs severed from the spine with an axe, and the lungs pulled out through the gaping wounds, left to flutter grimly like wings on the victim's shoulders. Historians fiercely debate the veracity of this act. Was the blood eagle a genuine Viking ritual, or merely a shocking literary invention concocted by later Christian monks to demonize the invaders? We may never know for certain, but the profound psychological impact of the legend remains chillingly undeniable. The immediate terror of the Northmen shattered the remaining Anglo-Saxon spirit. With both kings dead and the army annihilated, the Anglo-Saxon capital of Eoforwic was erased. In its place rose Viking Jorvik. The conquerors did far more than simply occupy the existing houses. They fundamentally reshaped the very DNA of the urban landscape. They rejected the rigid Roman grid system as impractical, carving out new, winding, organic streets that ignored the old imperial layout. They introduced a new language, new laws, and an aggressive commercial hunger that swiftly transformed York from a provincial military outpost into a burgeoning global powerhouse. The sword had completed its grim work. Now, it was time for the scales of commerce. The Viking warriors quickly wiped the blood from their axes and picked up the indispensable tools of the merchant. If you visit the Jorvik Viking Center today, the most precious artifact displayed behind glass is not a spectacular silver hoard or a golden sword hilt. It is, hilariously, a fossilized piece of human excrement. Known affectionately by archaeologists as the Lloyd's Bank coprolite, this astonishing 7-inch specimen, discovered beneath the pavement in 1972, remains the largest single piece of human feces ever unearthed. It functions as a bizarre, aromatic time capsule. Scientific analysis reveals that the Viking who produced it ate a diet heavy on meat and bread, but dangerously, almost fatally, low on vegetables. Even more disturbingly, the sample is absolutely riddled with the eggs of whipworm and other parasites. This one singular, earthy detail communicates more about the realities of daily life in Viking Jorvik than 1,000 sagas combined. The city was incredibly crowded, organically developed, and profoundly smelly. The inhabitants lived cheek by jowl with their animals, perpetually surrounded by human and industrial waste, thick wood smoke, and the persistent stench of manufacturing. Yet, astonishingly, amidst this filth, a highly sophisticated economic miracle unfolded. Excavations at Coppergate revealed that these so-called barbarians were, in fact, master craftsmen and sharp global capitalists. Jorvik rapidly became the Manhattan of the 10th century, a booming, critical trade hub where goods from the entire known world converged. Digging through the waterlogged soil, which perfectly preserves organic matter, archaeologists found Baltic amber, luxurious silk from Byzantium, cowrie shells sourced all the way from the Red Sea, and fine pottery from the Rhineland. The Vikings were fundamentally misunderstood if seen only as raiders. They were, in essence, the Amazon Prime delivery service of the Dark Ages, successfully connecting markets that had been isolated and dormant since the formal fall of Rome. The streets of Jorvik perpetually hummed with furious production. Antler workers expertly turned deer horns into sturdy composite combs, the versatile Viking equivalent of a Swiss army knife. Metal workers melted down vast quantities of stolen church silver to mint tens of thousands of St. Peter's pennies. Leather workers churned out thousands of pairs of shoes for a burgeoning population. This was, undeniably, a consumer society. The decisive violence of Ivar the Boneless had brutally purchased the political stability required for commerce to truly flourish. Eboracum had been a military base, Jorvik was a factory. This profound occupation fundamentally changed more than just the regional economy. It essentially rewrote the English dictionary. Most modern speakers don't realize it, but you speak a little bit of Viking every single day. Crucially, the Norse settlers did not force the locals to abandon their language. Instead, Old English and Old Norse violently collided, then merged into a functional hybrid. This is visible on the map of York itself, where the streets are called gates: Stonegate, Petergate, Coppergate, derived from the Norse word gata, meaning street. Confusingly, the actual defensive gateways are now called bars. Beyond topography, the Vikings bequeath English some of its most essential, everyday words. Basic nouns like egg, sky, skin, window, and knife are all permanent gifts from our Scandinavian ancestors. Furthermore, the very structure of the language simplified. Before the Vikings, English was a complex, gendered language, much like modern German. The sheer necessity of efficient trade between two groups who barely understood each other stripped the language down to its pragmatic, functional core. For nearly a century, Jorvik stood proud as an independent kingdom, a critical North Sea empire ruled by a succession of formidable warrior kings. The last of them was Eric Bloodaxe, a man whose very name screams unrestrained violence. He was a ruthless brute, famously expelled from Norway for fratricide, killing his own brothers, who sought a final refuge in York. But in 954 AD, Bloodaxe was finally driven out and cornered, killed in a lonely ambush on Steyne Moor. With his death, the independent Viking kingdom of York dissolved, finally absorbed into the emerging kingdom of England. The dragon ships stopped coming. The distinct, energetic hum of Norse voices on Coppergate began to fade into the local dialect. But just as York attempted to settle into this new, unified English identity, the horizon darkened yet again. A vast new fleet was rapidly building in Normandy. The worst days of York, far from being over, were just beginning. In the bitter winter of 1069, the exhausted people of York made a catastrophic miscalculation. Inspired by the sudden arrival of a supportive Danish fleet and fueled by a deep-seated hatred for their new Norman overlords, they rose up in rebellion. The Northumbrians stormed the city walls, brutally slaughtering the entire Norman garrison of 3,000 men. For a brief, intoxicating moment, York tasted freedom again. But they had tragically underestimated the cold, relentless fury of William the Conqueror. When news of the massacre reached him, William did not dispatch a diplomat or a general. He rode north himself at the head of a massive army, swearing by God's splendor that he would leave no living soul remaining to challenge his authority again. What followed is known to history as the Harrying of the North. While the term sounds almost poetic, the chilling reality was an extermination executed on an industrial scale. William correctly realized that fighting rebels man-to-man was inefficient and costly. Instead, he declared a total war on the food supply itself. He ordered his troops to fan out across Yorkshire, systematically burning every village, torching every standing crop, and smashing every plowshare. They slaughtered all the livestock they couldn't consume, leaving the rotting carcasses to poison the fields. They literally salted the earth. The intent was absolute: to create a lifeless desert where a vibrant civilization had once thrived. The result was a catastrophic humanitarian disaster that permanently scarred the history of York and the entire North for generations. Chronicler Orderic Vitalis, writing just a few decades later, notably broke from his typical praise of William to severely condemn the act. He recorded that well over 100,000 people, men, women, and children, starved to death. The survivors were reduced to walking skeletons. They resorted to eating their horses, then their dogs, and finally, according to the darkest historical accounts, consuming the flesh of the dead. Refugees desperately streamed south, often selling themselves into slavery just for a single meal. 17 years later, when the Normans compiled the comprehensive Doomsday Book to catalogue the wealth of England, the entry for Yorkshire contained a single, chilling Latin word repeated obsessively: vastata, waste. The land was utterly empty. The villages were gone. York itself, once the vibrant, bustling capital of the Vikings, lay as a smoking ruin. To ensure that the city could never rise in defiance again, William immediately ordered the construction of 2 formidable castles. He did not build them to protect the populace, he built them purely to subjugate them. One rose on Bale Hill, the other was constructed atop the mound that currently supports Clifford's Tower, built on the site of the old Viking palace. These were modern Motte and Bailey structures, topped with imposing wooden keeps, looming over the river Ouse like vigilant prison guards. The message was unmistakable: the days of independent power in the North were brutally over. The North was broken. From this point onward, York would be a Norman city, ruled by French-speaking lords who stared down from their high walls at the starving English survivors struggling in the mud below. As we will shortly see, these very wooden towers would soon become the setting for a tragedy far more focused and intense than the generalized starvation of the countryside. History often attempts to mask its darkest, most avaricious motives behind the shimmering veil of religion. In the spring of 1190, a perfect storm of social and political tension gathered over York. King Richard the Lionheart had recently departed for the Third Crusade, leaving a dangerous power vacuum in his absence. Across England, a violent wave of anti-Semitic hysteria followed the king's coronation. But in York, this generalized hatred was dangerously mixed with something far more pragmatic and immediate: debt. The local nobility, powerful men like Richard Maelbus, had borrowed heavily from Jewish moneylenders to fund their lavish lifestyles and expensive military campaigns. They saw the crusade not merely as a spiritual journey, but as a convenient, bloody opportunity to permanently erase their financial ledgers. On the fateful night of March 16th, the Sabbath before Passover, a violent mob descended upon the Jewish quarter. Terrified, the entire community, approximately 150 people, fled desperately to the royal castle for protection. They barricaded themselves inside the fragile wooden keep atop the mound where the stone Clifford's Tower stands today. In a tragic misunderstanding, when the royal constable temporarily left the tower on business, the frightened Jewish refugees, fearing ultimate betrayal, refused to let him back inside. Enraged and humiliated, the constable appealed to the High Sheriff of Yorkshire, who issued the fatal command. Attack! The doomed siege of Clifford's Tower had officially begun. For days, the baying mob circled the tower mound. It was a motley, cynical crew, religious zealots, opportunistic looters, and most dangerously, the heavily indebted knights who strategically directed the escalating violence. Inside the cramped wooden keep, the situation became utterly desperate. There was no food, no water, and the fragile walls shook violently under the constant battering from the crowd outside. Rabbi Yom Tov of Joini, the community's spiritual leader, understood there was no escape. Addressing his flock in the flickering, suffocating torchlight, he declared they had been chosen to die as martyrs for their faith. He offered them a dreadful choice: fall into the hands of the mob to be forcibly baptized and then brutally murdered, or take their own lives and die as free people. What followed chillingly echoes the ancient tragedy of Masada. The majority of the men chose the latter. In the suffocating heat, they set the timber structure on fire. Then, in a final act of devotion and despair, husbands cut the throats of their wives, and fathers killed their own children. Finally, the remaining men killed each other, until only the rabbi and one other man remained to complete the terrible deed. As the wooden keep rapidly turned into a towering inferno, the harrowing screams of the dying tragically mixed with the roar of the consuming flames. A few survivors, those who had refused the grim suicide pact, appeared on the ramparts at dawn. They desperately begged for mercy, promising to instantly convert to Christianity if their lives were spared. The mob deceitfully promised them safety. But the moment the survivors unlocked the gates and stumbled out, the crowd immediately reneged on their word, butchering every last man. The true, sordid motivation for this calculated slaughter revealed itself immediately after the last body fell. The ringleaders did not retreat to a church to pray. Instead, they marched straight to York Minster. They smashed their way violently into the treasury, seized the chest containing the Jewish financial records, the bonds, the contracts, and the strictures of debt, and set them ablaze right in the middle of the cathedral floor. In that raging bonfire, the entire financial debt owed by the local aristocracy instantly vanished. The horrific massacre at York was, fundamentally, a cynical bank robbery disguised as a holy crusade. Today, when you stand at the base of Clifford's Tower and observe the cheerful daffodils blooming on the grassy mound, remember that they grow from soil steeped in the ashes of 150 innocent souls, people betrayed by their neighbors, their king, and the very fortifications they sought for refuge. Guilt, perhaps, is a powerful motivator. In the decades following the Jewish massacre and the sustained brutality of the Norman conquest, the Church urgently sought to reassert its dominance, choosing to lead not through the sword, but through sheer architectural awe. They embarked on a project so ambitious it would ultimately consume the lives and labor of 10 successive generations of workmen. They decided to construct the largest Gothic cathedral in Northern Europe, York Minster. Yet, the builders faced a profound geological nightmare. As we know, York is built upon a soft glacial veil of clay and sand. The entire site is effectively a swamp. To attempt to build a mountain of stone in such a location was an act of audacious engineering defiance. The genius solution remains hidden beneath the floor. If you descend into the Minster's undercroft today, you can witness precisely how this cathedral defies gravity. The medieval engineers could not dig down to solid bedrock because none was within practical reach. Instead, the medieval engineers deployed an ingenious solution. they constructed the cathedral atop a colossal raft made of interlocking oak trees. Laid crisscross in the soft, saturated mud, this massive wooden foundation essentially allowed the millions of tons of limestone to float, much like an immense, slow-moving ship resting upon the earth. Construction commenced in 1220. The limestone was quarried from Tadcaster, miles away, and efficiently transported downstream on barges. For 2.5 centuries, the rhythmic sound of chisels striking magnesium limestone served as the very heartbeat of the growing city. As the walls rose, the architectural style itself evolved. The transepts were completed in the severe, pointed austerity of the early English style, but the subsequent nave exploded into the opulent, exuberant artistry of the decorated Gothic period, a symphony of stone foliage and intricate, almost lacy carvings. But just as the master masons reached the zenith of their artistic power, catastrophe struck. In 1349, a vessel docked at a nearby port, carrying rats infected with Yersinia pestis. The Black Death swept through York like a brutal scythe. It was a terrifying equalizer, ignoring social status. In the city's crowded, narrow streets, the mortality rate soared to 60%. Half the clergy perished. Crucially, the master masons, the only men who held the complex, internalized geometric secrets of the minster's design, were annihilated. Construction halted. The site fell tragically silent. When work finally resumed years later, necessity dictated a dramatic change in style. The ornate, flowery curves of the decorated period were abandoned, replaced by the stark, rational efficiency of the perpendicular style, vertical, repetitive, and geometrically simpler. Why? Because the masters were dead. The survivors required a blueprint that could be executed by fewer, less skilled hands. The architecture of the East End, therefore, remains a haunting, fossilized record of a pandemic's devastation. The Minster endured the plague, it survived the turbulence of the Reformation, yet in 1829, it nearly succumbed to a single match. Jonathan Martin, a former sailor suffering from profound religious psychosis, concealed himself within the minster after evening prayer. Convinced that the clergy were vipers, and the organ a tool of the devil, he waited. In the dead of night, he stacked prayer books and cushions beneath the choir stalls and set them alight. The ensuing conflagration was apocalyptic. The lead roof melted and rained down like liquid silver. The massive oak beams, which had supported the roof for centuries, crashed to the stone floor. The city awoke to the horrifying sight of the heart of Yorkshire glowing a fierce orange against the night sky. Martin was quickly apprehended and sent to Bedlam Asylum. But his destructive act proved a terrifying truth: centuries of collective genius can be undone in a single night by one man motivated by vengeance or malice. The fact that the Minster stands today is not a guarantee, it is a miracle, a continuous, relentless battle against gravity, fire, and the ravages of time itself. If you walk through Micklegate Bar today, you are passing beneath what was once the most gruesome art gallery in England. During the brutal 15th century, the Wars of the Roses, a devastating dynastic cage match between the House of Lancaster and the House of York, transformed this limestone archway into a revolving display of severed heads. For the people of this city, the conflict was intensely personal. In 1460, the severed head of Richard, Duke of York, was impaled on a spike right here. His enemies added a mocking paper crown to his brow, leaving his dead eyes to stare down impassively at the snow-covered road. Witnessing this atrocity was the Duke's son, the man who would eventually become King Richard III. To the rest of the world, and certainly to the enduring narrative cemented by William Shakespeare, Richard is a cartoon villain, a hunchbacked monster who murdered the young princes in the Tower. But in York, the historical narrative is radically different. Here, Richard was not a monster, he was a beloved hero. He spent his formative years absorbing the rugged culture of the North at nearby Middleham Castle. When he finally took the throne, he never forgot his regional loyalty. He slashed the city's taxes and mediated local disputes with a fairness that genuinely stunned the common people. While London may have feared him, York loved him. This fierce loyalty is officially recorded. On August 22, 1485, Richard rode out to the Battle of Bosworth Field to face the usurper Henry Tudor. He never returned, hacked to death in the mud, the last English king to fall in battle. When news reached York, the city council did not issue a polite, politically calculated statement welcoming the new Tudor king. Instead, the scribe penned a raw, dangerously seditious entry into the house books. King Richard late mercifully reigning upon us was through great treason piteously slain and murdered to the great heaviness of this city. Ponder the magnitude of that risk. In an era when speaking against the new regime meant losing your head, the leaders of York officially recorded their profound grief for a man the rest of the nation now called a tyrant. Centuries later, the discovery of the king's skeleton beneath a Leicester car park confirmed what Yorkists had suspected all along. The remains showed severe scoliosis, a curvature of the spine, but no withered arm, nor any physical deformity that would have hampered his ability to wield a lance in battle. The efficient Tudor propaganda machine had taken a simple medical condition and twisted it into a physical mark of evil. Richard's broken body, unceremoniously dumped in a shallow grave, told the story of a brutal death. But his legacy in York remained steadfastly one of justice. He was a northern king who understood that the capital of the north deserved respect, not just ruthless taxation. But with Richard's death, the white rose wilted. The Tudors consolidated power, and York's political influence began its slow, inevitable wane. The city turned inward. As the medieval era gave way to the modern, the grand castles and religious fervor started to fade, replaced by a new kind of urban grit. The city became a dangerous maze of dark alleyways, highwaymen, and butchers. The romance of knights was over. The era of the slum had arrived. Today, the Shambles is frequently voted the most picturesque street in Britain. Tourists flock here to buy novelty wands and take selfies, captivated by the timber-framed buildings that lean toward one another, almost touching overhead. But if you could time travel back to the 16th century, you wouldn't be reaching for a camera. You would be desperately reaching for a handkerchief to cover your nose. The Shambles is not about magic, it is fundamentally about meat. The name itself originates from the Saxon word fleeshamels, meaning flesh shelves. Look closely at the shop fronts. Those wide, heavy wooden window ledges were never intended for displaying souvenirs. They were used for stacking raw beef and pork in the open air. The buildings overhang the street not for architectural flair, but for utility, to cast a permanent shadow over the meat below, preventing it from rotting too quickly. And the channel running down the center of the cobblestones? That wasn't for rainwater runoff. It served as a sluice for the blood, guts, and offal washed out from the slaughterhouses located just behind the shops. Flies buzzed in thick clouds. The stench was so potent it felt solid enough to chew. This was a place of commerce, yes, but a vivid commerce of death. The inherent violence in York wasn't confined to the butchers. It spilled out onto the roads leading into the city. The 18th century ushered in the era of the highwayman, and one name dominates the folklore: Dick Turpin. Pop culture paints him as a dashing rogue, a gentleman thief who famously rode his faithful mare, Black Bess, from London to York in a single legendary night. The reality, however, is pathetic and brutal. Turpin was nothing more than a common thug. He began his career not by charming ladies but by torturing an old woman, roasting her over her own fire until she revealed where she kept her life savings. He never rode Black Bess to York. That epic journey was entirely the invention of a Victorian novelist. Turpin arrived in York under the false name John Palmer, desperate to hide from the law. He wasn't captured in a blaze of glory. He was arrested for the petty crime of shooting a neighbor's rooster. A letter he wrote from his cell in York Castle Prison revealed his handwriting to his old schoolmaster, who identified him for a bounty. On April 7, 1739, he was hanged at the Knavesmire execution ground. Lacking any real friends, he hired professional mourners to weep for him. The legend of the hero is a lie. The truth is merely a small, violent man dangling at the end of a rope. As the Industrial Revolution took hold, the misery of the highway gave way to the grim realities of the urban slum. By the late 19th century, York was a city defined by startling inequality. While the minster gleamed majestically overhead, the poor rotted in districts like Hungate and Wamgate. But help emerged from an unexpected source: chocolate. The Rowntree family, Quaker confectioners, built a colossal cocoa empire in the city. Yet Seabohm Rowntree was far more than a capitalist. He was a pioneering sociologist. He walked the streets of York, knocking on doors and meticulously compiling a groundbreaking study titled Poverty, a Study of Town Life. Published in 1901, the findings shocked the nation. Rowntree proved that nearly 28% of the population of this ancient, proud city lived in primary poverty, meaning their total earnings were insufficient to buy enough food simply to keep their bodies functioning. His exhaustive work shamed the British government into action, effectively laying the foundations for the modern welfare state. The sweet, comforting scent of roasting cocoa beans from the Rowntree factory became the odor of social progress, finally masking the lingering stench of the slaughterhouse. It is no coincidence that York is widely considered the most haunted city in Europe. When a single location accumulates 2,000 years of invasion, massacre, plague, and intense religious fervor, the psychological weight of the past becomes palpable, almost tangible. Yet the ghosts of York are rarely described as wispy, transparent specters. They are solid. They have mass. They carry the mud of the centuries on their boots. The most famous sighting in the city's history perfectly illustrates this phenomenon. In 1953, a plumber named Harry Martindale was working alone in the cellar of the treasurer's house, installing a new heating system. Suddenly, he heard the sharp blare of a trumpet. A draft horse pulling a cart emerged directly from the solid brick wall, immediately followed by a column of weary Roman soldiers. They were not marching on the cellar floor. They were walking on a level approximately 18 inches below it, meaning they were visible only from the knees up. They looked exhausted and dirty. They paid the terrified plumber absolutely no attention as they marched right through the opposite wall and vanished. Later archaeological surveys confirmed that 18 inches below the cellar floor lies the original Roman road, the Via Decumana. Harry hadn't seen a ghost in the traditional sense. He had seen a recording, a moment of time locked into the stone, replaying itself across the centuries. This story captures the very essence of York's history. This city is a palimpsest, a manuscript that has been written upon, scraped clean, and meticulously written over again dozens of times. When you walk through the streets today, you are walking atop the Viking leatherworkers of Coppergate. You are walking over the ashes of the Jewish martyrs at Clifford's Tower. You are stepping on the invisible grid of the original Roman fortress. The modern city is merely a thin veneer of asphalt and glass laid precariously over a deep reservoir of human experience. The ghosts are simply the concentrated memories of the millions who lived, loved, suffered, and died here, refusing to be completely forgotten. From the gypsum burials that preserve the faces of the dead to the chocolate factories that tried to save the living from destitution, York teaches us that civilization is profoundly fragile. Great empires like Rome fall. Commercial hubs like Jorvik vanish. Magnificent cathedrals can be gutted by a single malicious flame. But the human spirit, the sheer, stubborn will to endure the mud, the cold, and the cruelty, it always persists. York is not just a museum of the past, it is a mirror for the present. It reminds us that we, too, are just another layer of history currently in the making. So the next time you visit, don't just look up at the soaring spires of the minster. Look down. That is where the true story lies. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the bloody, brilliant, and deeply resilient history of York, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next documentary. And I want to hear from you. Which era of York's intense history do you think you could survive? The brutal Roman frontier, the chaotic Viking port, or the grinding reality of the Victorian slum? Let me know your choice in the comments below. Thank you for watching.